right, well, it's 8:31, so we'll go ahead and get started. Good morning, everybody. My name's Noah Newman, technology editor with No-Till Farmer, and we want to thank you for joining us for today's live and very timely webinar, Harvest Weather Outlook with ForGround by Bayer and BAM Weather. Today's presenters are Brett Waltz from BAM Weather and Tyler Williams from Bayer. So on your screen, before we get started, just want to let you know about the Q&A icon there at the bottom of your screen. So you can submit questions there during any time during the presentation, and we'll take all those questions at the end of the presentation for Tyler and Brett. And we are also recording today's session in the event you want to go back and watch it or share it with anyone. So let's get started. Without further ado, I'll hand it off to you, Tyler.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks everyone for jumping on. Appreciate you having us and taking time out of your day. And so on the next slide, I'll just go through a little bit of the agenda and then what we're up to today. We're really just going to kind of start. We'll do a little intro of ourselves. And then kind of the main show of that harvest weather outlook. And then really at the end, I'll try to wrap up some of that weather predictions and tie that into what it means for growers that are doing cover crops or no-till or strip-till, and just kind of some things to look for. And then, of course, we'll have some time for Q&A. And so, again, kind of the introductions here on the next slide there, Brett. So, like I said, I'm Tyler Williams. I'm an agronomist with ForGround by Bayer. What we do at ForGround is, we're a sort of a regenerative ag platform and really try to help growers in many different aspects, improve their operations, especially, improve their success with cover crops, their success with no-till and strip-till. And one of those ways we try to do that is through weather webinars like this. So again, anyone can sign up for ForGround. It's free. You can get these monthly newsletters that we include weather from BAM as well, and try to really tie that into your operation and try to stay timely. And so again, thank you everyone for coming. Brett, I didn't mention I got an undergrad degree in meteorology, so I'm here for fact-checking purposes only, primarily. So no pressure at all. But thanks again for you all and for jumping on. We really appreciate kind of the weather expertise that you can bring to us and bring to farmers. So I'll go ahead and kick it over to you.
Well, thank you so much, and I appreciate the fact checking. I'm always happy to adjust and learn as I go along. But again, my name is Brett Waltz. I am the Chief Communications Officer and a meteorologist at BAM Weather. I've been here for about 7 years, and BAM's main goal is to really kind of empower people with a different type of weather forecasts that are more personalized, for the specific end user, the specific industry. And we work a lot with farmers and folks in the agriculture community across really the entirety of the United States. And so just kind of providing that more personalized forecast, more detailed forecast than where you can get anywhere else. And in this specific webinar, going to be focusing a little bit more in on the extended range forecast and how the harvest season is expected to evolve. And so again, going to really focus kind of on September, October, November. How are we going to expect things to evolve as we work into harvest? Will there be more drought expansion? Will areas continue to see rains, or will we get dry stretches to help us get harvest in? And so that'll kind of be the main topic of conversation as we go throughout this webinar. And I want to start with drought conditions because I want to start with where we've been, how we have experienced this growing season so far, and really for a good portion of the Midwest and where a lot of corn is grown, haven't had any issues throughout the season of significant dryness. We haven't had significant dry stretches. June was very, very active for parts of Iowa and Minnesota. It was one of the most active Junes on record there. The areas that have had more dryness were further down to the south: Kansas, Oklahoma, Texas at times, and even the lower Ohio Valley. You can see some extreme drought conditions actually in parts of southern Ohio. Those areas started the season dry and are actually ending on a drier note right now. The chart on the right, the map on the right, is a look at how drought has changed or expanded over the past 4 weeks. And I do think it's important to kind of look as we go into the fall season. It's historically one of the drier times of the year. And we still have some warmth and some heat to deal with. And you can see that over the past 4 weeks here, that those yellows and oranges that have kind of developed across parts of the Western Plains, and again, parts of the Ohio Valley, we have seen some expansion of abnormally dry and drought conditions. And I do think that that is something worth watching as we go into the fall season. If we take a look at our current soil moisture percentile, this is from our Clarity platform, which is where we host a lot of our weather forecasts. You can see that we actually have some lower percentiles, which just means basically on a scale of all time records, I think going back into the 1950s, we are lower than normal in terms of soil moisture across parts of the plains, across the lower Ohio Valley, especially. And so there is the risk that if we don't continue to get some rains as we go into September, especially if it's a drier month, there is the risk that we could see some additional drought expansion. The soil moisture right now, and this is kind of throughout the entire column, a little bit lower than normal across parts of Nebraska, Kansas, and then again, especially parts of the Ohio River Valley there in southern Indiana and into Ohio. Looking at how things have evolved for the summer as a whole, it's actually been a cooler than normal summer for a good portion of the north central part of the country. A lot of the heat has been situated on the coast. If you average it all out for the U.S. as a whole, it's been one of the warmest summers ever. But for where a lot of the growing is happening across the central part of the country, it's been seasonable to even cooler than normal. And if we look at this map on the right, the one basically means wettest of all time. Southern Minnesota, this is through August 20th, wettest summer of all time, which is kind of crazy to think about. A lot of that happened early on in the summer, but a lot of greens on here, indicating that it's been a wetter than normal summer to allow for not a lot of stress with the crop. The more greens that you see here, the less stress degree days that those individual districts have had, which is, again, a base of 86. It's basically past 86, and feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, then that's not as effective with growing the crop. The higher that you go here, we haven't had a lot of days basically of 95 to 100 degrees until this week. Basically, we're going to have a lot more of that as we go throughout this week. Summer's going to end on a hot note, but to this point, we haven't had a lot of that. And so there hasn't been a ton of stress in terms of temperatures on the crops as we've gone throughout this growing season. In terms of the next couple of weeks, as I mentioned, heat in the short term. In fact, some record-breaking heat possible across the Ohio Valley over the next couple of days. And it's going to be a warm stretch. The next 3 or 4 days, temperatures and heat indices into the 100s, 110s across the Midwest and the Ohio Valley. We'll have more heat expand down across the southern tier of the U.S. as we go into the weekend, into the holiday weekend. But it's not necessarily, especially further east, going to stick around. We have another front that will work into next week, which will limit how long this heat can hang around. Now, I think that the Canadian prairies, though, and the far northwest plains, those are going to be areas into September that see more consistently above normal temperatures. It'll feel a little bit more like summer for longer across the Canadian prairies, across the western plains, while the eastern half of the country starts out feeling a little bit more like fall, more like what we were last week, where we had some record-breaking cool temperatures across a good portion of the United States. In terms of moisture, and I want to kind of extend on the conversation on drought here, continuing to see the area that cashes in on the most rains ahead across the upper Midwest, across parts of the eastern Dakotas, Minnesota, Iowa. These areas continue to just see these timely rains to finish off the crop. However, further to the south, parts of Kansas, Missouri, Indiana, even Kentucky, Ohio, it's messier. I don't think it's bone dry ahead, but I think that the rain accumulations end up being hit or miss in nature. Some areas get lucky and cash in, some areas miss out, kind of that messy, still summertime type of thunderstorm pattern that we're going to be dealing with. And then as we build that front in next week, it gets dry. I think the Great Lakes, the Ohio Valley, again, drier than normal. And so there is some concern that especially the Ohio Valley could see some of that abnormally dry conditions expand while the Western Plains continues to see some moisture. Looking out through mid-September, as I kind of mentioned before, the plains, and especially the Canadian prairies and the Western Plains, hotter than normal. I think that the further east you go, the more ups and downs that we see in the pattern. Though I do think the back third or so of September can end on a warmer note for much of the country. I think that the further we go into fall, the warmer the temperatures will be compared to normal, the less it will maybe feel like fall. And we've got some of this fall-like weather that we had last week. We may have some of next week, especially further off to the east. It may not necessarily stick around as we go into the back half of the month. I also think it can be dry. Some of this will have to do with tropical activity. We'll have to keep an eye on that. It's been relatively inactive the past couple of weeks in terms of that. It's always a wild card. There's no telling if a storm will go up into the Gulf of Mexico or if it'll go up the East Coast, but it always has an impact on the pattern in the US because it tends to pull moisture away when we get those tropical systems. And so that'll be something to watch. I'd say the highest threats are kind of along the Gulf Coast and up the East Coast. I don't see a strong signal for activity coming northward into the plains or into the Ohio Valley, at least over the next few weeks, but always a wild card to watch. So with the forecast out through the next few weeks, I want to kind of focus in on the rest of the harvest season. And I think a lot of what is going to drive our pattern ahead, and really a lot of what drives it year round, is the equatorial Pacific Ocean and what we call La Nina or El Nino. Last year, we were in a strong El Nino. This year, we're working into more of a neutral state or even a weak La Nina as we go throughout the fall season. What I have here is a look at the current sea surface temperatures. You can see some of the cooler than normal waters here that have developed here along the coast of South America and then out towards the dateline. Right now, in terms of our official readings, we're not quite to La Nina territory. These waters need to be consistently about a half a degree Celsius below normal to be in La Nina territory. We're not there yet. And the model data ahead kind of keeps us either cool neutral, just above that minus 0.5, or in a weak La Nina state as we go into fall. And so that's always a good place to start in terms of our weather ahead. One of the best places and one of the most consistently accurate ways to forecast a season ahead is looking at what we call ENSO, or again, that La Nina or El Nino state. And so the very first thing that I do is look at years that were similar into the fall months. And a couple of years that I have plotted here, 2021, 2017, 2016, 2013, 08, 05, 01, and then kind of into the 90s there. These are the years that match up closest to where we're expected to be going. And then from there, once we kind of have that set of analogs, we can kind of break things down into what does that actually mean? And if we look at these years that had a cool neutral or a weak La Nina state into fall, tends to support hotter than normal conditions. And again, we're already, I think, seeing maybe the first wave of that at the end of August. We'll have some cooler air in early September, but I do think that the signs are there based off of this for more widespread above normal temperatures to work into the central part of the country as we go throughout the fall months. It also tends to support dryness down to the south, down across the Cotton Belt. After we get past tropical season, Tennessee Valley, the deep south, the southern plains, these are areas that tend to run drier when we get this type of a setup. May recall a couple of years like 2016, for example, actually had wildfire issues in Tennessee as we worked throughout that fall. And I think that there is a little bit of a concern for some continued or for some increasing dryness as we go throughout the fall months based off of these. But it's just one factor. It's the biggest factor, but there are other factors that we need to keep in mind. One of them is the Pacific Ocean. And our weather comes from Asia. The jet streams that transport our storm systems and our moisture works right across the North Pacific Ocean. And so what these ocean waters are doing, whether they're colder than normal, whether they're warmer than normal, has an impact on our pattern. And this index in particular is what I call the Pacific Decadal Oscillation. You'll note it's decadal. It typically gets into a state of positive or negative and stays there for 10, 20 years. We've been the last several years in a very negative state or a cold PDO phase. And so I wanted to look at these years and determine what could that mean for fall, and especially for precipitation. What does it mean? And typically, it really favors some dryness. It favors drier than normal conditions across much of the plains, especially the southern plains, into the Midwest, into the Great Lakes, with your primary storm track kind of out in the Mountain West and up the East Coast. Again, similar to those La Nina analogs that we talked about, these favor hotter than normal conditions, especially across Canada, especially across the north central part of the country. And so we have some analogs talking. It's always good when you look at different pattern drivers and they have similar outcomes. Makes my job a little bit easier compared to if we were to look at a whole bunch of different pattern drivers and one was cold and wet and the other was hot and dry. We're seeing some consistency here, which is a good thing. The last part here that I wanted to look at was just overall ocean analogs. There are other parts of the ocean that impact our pattern. The Indian Ocean is a big one. Whether it's warmer or cooler than normal, it impacts thunderstorms and convection on the equator. It impacts the jet streams. It impacts our weather here in the US. And if we look at top analogs for just the entire globe, again, you get that same type of idea. It's a warmer than normal look across the central part of the country, across Canada, and really for the US as a whole. And it's drier the further south that you go. These are a little bit wetter across parts of the northern plains, the Ohio Valley. I know while it's not necessarily ideal to be super active in the harvest season, I know that parts of Indiana and Ohio could use some rain. Looking at all of these combined, we came up with our top analog years, our top 6 or 7 years. And it's not surprising that it matches up with these ideas overall very well. Would favor the warmest conditions this fall to be across the north central part of the country and the driest conditions to be across the southern tier of the United States. Not necessarily soaked across the northern plains, but I wouldn't say super dry either. I do think that as we get into the middle part of fall, there is the potential for Indiana, Ohio, Michigan, and into the northeastern part of the country to be a little bit wetter and to kind of trend wetter versus where they have been. I also look at model data, and I think one thing that I want to make the note of, model data at a seasonal timescale isn't always super useful. It's not completely useless, but you tend to get more variability. And I would say that the model data tends to have some biases. We always try to look at research and analogs first and look at our pattern drivers first before we look at model data and then see if we can have some supporting model guidance to support our forecast. In general, these are warm, especially the two on the bottom here. This is the American data, these two on the bottom. The one that's a little bit cooler, that's the outlier, is the Canadian model. And I want to talk about why here later in this video. I think this would primarily come late in the fall season, kind of into November. I think November is the biggest wild card month of the fall season. We'll talk a little bit about that here later. But 3 out of 4 of these have that drier than normal southern tier of the US idea, but not a super wet pattern across the north central part of the country in any of these. Taking a look month by month. So September, we've kind of already talked about at the short term and then into the middle part of September. Again, you can see the idea warm central US. I think that, again, a big wild card in September specifically, if I can pull out my drawing tool here, is this. These analogs, a couple of years, had tropical activity work through the Gulf of Mexico. I don't see strong signals for that right now, so I think that the risk is to be drier than these analogs across this region that I have circled. In terms of, let me see, erase ink, there we go. In terms of October, this is where you really see the dryness south start to pick up. This is where the deep south, the cotton belt down there, that's where things start to get dry, I think October, and where you can start to get more moisture across the Ohio Valley. November, again, these analogs are very warm, but I think it's the wild card month based off some of the years that I looked at. Let me go back to this in a second. I want to come to here real quick. Forecast risk. And again, I think this is primarily November. There are different types of La Niñas. Some of them set up with the coolest waters in the Central Pacific. Some of them set up more so near South America. Years that had the coolest waters closer to South America tended to be colder in fall, and it was primarily in November. The majority of the top analog years are hotter in November. We go kind of back over here. But I think the big risk and the big wild card is if we set those colder waters up closer to South America more consistently, we could end fall on a cooler note. Maybe a mix of these two ideas would be a good idea for November. And that's ultimately what we did for our outlooks. So here's it all broken down. September, October, November. It's warm overall, especially across the central part of the country. It's dry overall, especially October and November south. September starts out pretty dry across a good part of the ag belt as well. I think November opens the door for maybe a hotter start and then more of those cold fronts and cold shots, maybe Arctic shots late November across the eastern part of the country to kind of mix those analog packages a little bit. In terms of how we all average out, I really think it's a pretty mild fall across the north central part of the country. And I think much of the country is warmer than normal. Again, maybe early and late, some cooler air east, but I don't see a major concern here based off of this for early frost and freeze. And I'll kind of break that down for you here in a few. In terms of precip, again, I think drier south, drier plains at times. Ohio Valley gets a little bit more active as the season goes along. In terms of those drought risks, this is an area in here that I would be concerned about some expansion. I think at first the Ohio Valley can see some of that, but gets better as we go throughout the season. But the rains could pick up just in time for harvest, which could make that a little bit more challenging across parts of the Ohio Valley. Moving along here, here's a look at some of our freeze data. First 32-degree freeze. These are our top analog years, a couple of cities in here that we've kind of targeted across the central part of the country in some of the growing regions. The oranges here basically just indicate a later than normal freeze. The darker the orange, it means it's much later than normal. And we look at these analog averages out here to the right, pretty much all of these are later than normal. And in some cases by a week or two. Really, the only year in here that was consistently earlier than normal was 2001, and I'm always hesitant the further back that you go, the less relevant that these analogs are. Just from a climatology standpoint, typically years that are a little bit closer are better indications of the frost and the freeze potential, just from my experience. And so overall, the signal here is a pretty good one for a later than normal freeze. And I would say the same thing for frost. There are a couple of more years in here that had some earlier frost across parts of the ag belt, specifically across parts of the northern plains, South Dakota, Minnesota, North Dakota, but not a strong signal. I would say that's primarily because some of these years had what we call recurving typhoons. Typhoons in the West Pacific can sometimes impact the jet stream and lead to colder shots of air in the U.S. about 6 to 10 days later. It's one of the reasons we're getting a decent little cold front next week, but not strong enough of a signal to support, any kind of a notable early first frost for any of these locations. Again, most of them a week or two later than normal on these top overall analogs. And so, just kind of a takeaway here, I really don't have any major early frost and freeze concerns. Maybe watch early September cold fronts across the northern plains, but I don't see a major signal for that. Certainly, I don't see any kind of extended cold shots for the plains. It looks warm overall. And I think fall is mild overall. Early and late, there could be some cold shots east. I do think that there are plenty of dry stretches for harvest, especially across the southern half of the United States. Again, I think the Ohio Valley is a spot that starts dry and could get wetter with time. But we'll need to watch for some drought expansion possible in the southern and the central plains. And then in terms of La Nina, we have to watch the orientation. If we set up those coldest waters more towards South America, it could allow fall to end on a colder note as a whole. I'll kind of breeze through these last couple of slides and we can finalize things, and I'll turn things back over to Tyler. But in terms of hurricane season, we've had several storms. A couple of them have been more impactful. Beryl, Debbie, we had a couple of impactful storms, but it hasn't been quite as active as what, honestly, I would have expected that it could have been, given the ocean waters being way warmer than normal, given the fact that we're working into more of a La Nina, which is typically more favorable for hurricane activity. There's been a couple of instances of some dust, which I think is probably ultimately why uh, we haven't seen more consistent activity. Dust tends to suppress hurricane activity, and we've had a lot of that coming off of Africa. We've still been above normal for the season as a whole, but I don't see major signs ahead that it's going to pick up substantially. We'll need to watch maybe the second week of September. But I don't see a crazy signal for 4, 5, 6 storms at once or anything like that ahead. And so it's always a threat as we work into fall. It's always a forecast risk to watch, but I don't see it as a major influence like a 2020 or a 2005, at least at this time. Real quick, severe weather. One thing that I think is often forgotten is fall can be secondary severe weather season. And with the warmer than normal pattern, I do think that the Ohio Valley, especially parts of the Northeast, could be at play for some late season clashing of air masses, late season severe weather risk. Nothing like what we had in spring. It was one of the most active severe weather seasons of all time out there. I think it was just behind 2011 being the most active, but could be some late season threats that we need to keep an eye on. And then before we go, let's just talk about winter, just real quick, just as a little teaser. East versus West La Nina, we talked about that with fall. East-based La Ninas near South America tend to be cold. Central or western ones tend to be a little bit warmer. If we look at our overall ocean analogs, it tends to kind of blend the two together. Based off this, the winter would be colder to the north, warmer down to the south, or more seasonable. Would be an active storm track through parts of the Midwest, the Ohio Valley. Maybe more snow opportunities in there this upcoming winter compared to certainly the last several, which have been pretty lackluster. If we look at a couple of other factors here, our Pacific Ocean state, you can see it tends to support more cold across the north central part of the country. But again, this would favor kind of the storm track through here. Midwest Ohio Valley could be more active for snow. This, though, and I'll look at this here in a second, but doesn't necessarily favor a lot of activity across the plains. So if drought conditions expand there, I don't think it's going to be a super snowy winter out there across the south central and central plains. I do think, and where data and analogs agree in general, December is probably the coldest month of winter. I think winter gets started out on a fast note across especially the northern tier of the U.S. Looking here at top winter analogs as a whole, cooler north, warmer south, not active across the plains. In fact, this would be a relatively much below normal snow winter across parts of the plains. That would be drought concerns as we work into next spring, because this is when we replenish a lot of the moisture. You can see above normal further off to the north. I know it's below normal for the Ohio Valley, but compared to recent years, it would still be a good bit more snow than they've had over the past really 3 or 4 years plus. So that pretty much is my outlook in terms of winter ahead. Here's a look at our preliminary outlooks here. Again, cooler north, warmer south, drier in the central part of the country. But that's the full overview in terms of not only the next 3 months, but a teaser for the winter season ahead. Really appreciate you all taking the time to watch the forecast. I'd be happy to kind of take some questions at the end, I believe. But with that, I will turn it back over to Tyler. And again, I appreciate you all having me.
Yeah, thanks, Brett. That was good. You had me thinking very positively until you showed the winter outlook. So cold and dry in Nebraska is usually not a favorable winter for my liking, but that's okay.
Yeah.
Well, you can't do anything about it. We know. So
we still have a couple of months to fine tune some things. So I'll see what I can do to put in a good word.
you could fine tune maybe some moisture and a little bit warmer temperatures. That'd be great. So really what we like to do is try to, at ForGround, try to connect all the dots together, just really to help you all make better decisions, kind of think about, all right, we've got this forecast now. What do we do? How does that matter? What can we think about as we start to look towards harvest, look towards fall, and really kind of the key things that come, again, growers doing cover crops and no-till. It really comes down to kind of getting those cover crops seeded for many people. So really, thinking about the dry potential over the next month or two, how could that might adjust your seeding method. A lot of folks try to get things in early and might broadcast their cover crops, but you definitely want to make sure you either had good moisture on the ground or moisture in the forecast in order to do that. Now you can lean towards some of that smaller seeded cover crops as well if you're going to go ahead and go out there and broadcast that in there. But you really want to pay attention to that forecast. Is if there's no rain for a couple weeks and you're already kind of dry, you're probably just going to be throwing money out there and just tossing it out the window. You're probably better off waiting till after harvest and drilling that cover crop in just to get a better chance of that cover crop actually growing. A lot of people, I shouldn't say all because the northern plains aren't like this, but a lot of people were able to get some of the crops in early. Things were relatively warm early. There are places in the northern plains in Wisconsin and Minnesota I know were pretty late. So we probably have a pretty big window of crop growth out there right now. So warmth and maybe relatively dry might speed up some of those cash crops. So, but that also could be a positive for cover crop growth. If we're able to get those corn, soybeans out early, we can drill those cover crops in there. We can extend that frost, hopefully able to get some good growth this fall. So I'd really think about, maybe planning to drill those cover crops if we're going to have a little bit of an extended growing season and maybe a normal harvest timing. So again, think about that. Think about putting in your winter annuals. Rye is always a good one because it does germinate, pretty late into the season for many of you, and you can maybe get some good fall growth out of that. When it comes to like managing residue, I always advocate for leaving the stalks up. I know a lot of people like to lay them down, but if you can leave those stalks upright, that really helps capture some of that snow, especially if you're in the northern areas where anytime it snows, it blows. You can really capture a lot of that moisture and keep it on your field as opposed to it blowing to the neighbors. And that can add up to an inch or two of moisture throughout the winter that you might be able to capture there. So especially if winter moisture is limited, keep those stalks upright and keep that snow from blowing. Prevent the stalks from blowing around. Then you get the windrowing patterns and you just get uneven planting. So again, key thing to look at right now is try to leave those stalks upright, get even distribution out the back end of that combine just to try to get even moisture across that field. And then I know a lot of folks strip till and put on fall fertilizer with the strip till machine. Moisture is always a plus or minus on that. You don't want it too wet, you don't want it too dry. Kind of every farmer I talk to doesn't want it too wet or too dry. But especially when you're strip tilling or putting on anhydrous, if it's too wet, you're gonna cause some compaction and smearing. If it's too dry, you might lose some of that fertilizer out and just not do a good job. So again, try to find that happy button with that fall strip tilling. So those just kind of the main things that I saw just looking at Brett's forecast and things that we can think about. Again, we do this every month, and so I always encourage people to sign up at BayerForGround.com. You can sign up for our newsletter. We work with BAM every month to try to put together some of these forecasts and tie it to the timely agronomic things that many of you might be looking at. And then really just Brett, on my next slide is the sales pitch at the very end. And I bring this up because we're getting a lot of interest from growers kind of looking into the whole carbon programs, cover crop programs, and what exists out there. And that's one thing that we try to bring through ForGround is revenue opportunities in addition to the agronomic opportunities. And the carbon program is one of these. And we've shown this a few times, and we've been out and about for a few years with this program. But we've expanded quite a bit this year to a number of different geographies and states that we weren't in before. Same thing with a number of different crops. So really wanted to just put out the map here of the eligible states, and then on the right-hand side, the eligible crops. We also added in a nitrogen management program this year as well. Again, trying to get into that nitrogen space because we know that there's an opportunity there from an environmental benefit. And so you can kind of see some things on there. I definitely would check that out. You can find it at BayerForGround.com. We have eligibility calculators, those types of things. But right now we're also doing an enrollment bonus in Nebraska, Iowa, Illinois, Wisconsin, and Minnesota, which would add an extra $4 on top of the $6 per acre for this program. So again, I just encourage people to check this out. Again, you sign up for ForGround, it's free. We send you out notifications on opportunities that come up in your state, in addition to the agronomic information that we bring you as well. So that's pretty much all I have here. I think that's maybe the last slide that we have. And no, I don't know if there are any questions or anything popping up in the Q&A or the chat, but this is probably the time to do it, and we can try to answer those or address anything that comes up.
Yeah, absolutely. Right now is the time to get your questions in. Bottom of your screen, you see the little Q&A box. Click that, type in your question, and I'll get those relayed to Tyler and Brett. Nothing right now in the queue, but I'll start with this. So Brett, you were saying that right now it's looking like the winter's going to start fast in December, and December could be the worst winter month.
Yeah, I do. I think so. Just from a historical standpoint, these cool, neutral, or weak La Nina states the past 20 years, regardless of what has happened the rest of winter, they've started out on a colder note. Even 2016, 2017, that winter was warm overall, but it started out colder and a little bit snowier in December. And so I would say December's probably my highest confidence month right now, that it can start out on a colder note, especially the further north you are in the country.
And so, Tyler, you kind of touched on this in your recap, but your key takeaways. But so if that does play out, where December is kind of a rough winter for a lot of people, how should that affect their cover crop plans?
Yeah, most folks, maybe a little bit further in the south, it might be a little different, but many in the kind of the Corn Belt will probably already have it signed and sealed what they're planning to do. If it's going to hit fast, and sometimes timing might not be exact, right? It might come a little bit earlier in November. I know a lot of people that will try to drill their cover crops and get a lot of fall field work done in mid-November and even into December, as much as Mother Nature will let you. So I think maybe thinking about not waiting for that last chance opportunity, maybe trying to plan to get that done so you're done before Thanksgiving, so you're not trying to get any of that stuff in, especially if winter does come in raring and roaring pretty quickly.
Scott wants to know: is this going to be a repeat of December of 1983?
Yeah, I'm pulling that up here because I seem to remember that being an extremely cold December, and I don't think it's that cold, but I want to verify if it's as cold as what I remember before I answer that question. I want to be careful here, and not corner myself, but no. So that was, yes, an extremely cold, one of the coldest Decembers of all time. I don't see that. I don't see it being that cold. I think it's more comparable to recent colder Decembers. Again, like a 2017 or 2016, maybe even a 2013. It was a very snowy December, but it was pretty cold north and a little bit warmer south and east. I don't think it's, polar vortex record breaking cold or anything like that. But comparatively, compared to the last several Decembers, I do think it can be colder than that.
And then I guess just kind of in general, would you say the weather outlook for this harvest season? How does that kind of stack up to what we saw last year over a lot
Yeah,
good,
so
good chunk of the country?
it should be a bit different than last year. I again historically, especially the mid to latter part of El Nino falls tend to have more cold. We go back to a couple of major Novembers that were cold, like 2014 and 2019. Those were El Ninos. La Ninas tend to run warmer as a whole, and so I think comparatively it's warmer, and it's drier than it was last year.
All right. Once again, if you have any questions, we have a few more minutes if you want to get those in. Also, friendly reminder, we are recording today's session, so if you want to go back and watch anything from Tyler or Brett's presentation, you'll be able to do so. We usually get the recording posted within 48 hours on no-tillfarmer.com, and it will also be on our No-Till Farmer YouTube channel as well if you want to go back and watch or share with any of your farm crew, neighbors, or anyone else. Yeah, not seeing any questions right now. Tyler, any other big takeaways from Brett's outlook that kind of stuck out to you?
I mean, I maybe I've got a question for Brett, and that's around the severe weather side of things and a little bit on the timing. Some late places might have some stock issues. Anytime you get severe weather in the fall, it's to me the worst time you can get severe weather, especially wind events. And we just think about the stock and corn standing out there. What's that? Maybe you could give me is there any like timeline thoughts on severe weather, and maybe is that an early September thing or a mid-October thing?
I honestly, I think it's more October, November, probably mid to late October and into November. It's just naturally as you get really closer to Halloween, you start getting those clashing of air masses a little bit more as you really start to transition seasons. And so just thinking back, I believe 2013 had a severe weather outbreak in November. I think 2017, if I'm remembering correctly, might have had one in October. So I think it's more the back half of fall than the front half. I think the front half can have more dry time in general and be a little bit less active for severe weather compared to the back half.
Most people will be happy to hear that.
Good deal.
Yeah, no, looks like no one has any questions. So I think that says you guys covered it really well. I'll give the floor to you guys if you have any other final thoughts you want to share with our audience here before we kind of wrap things up.
I really just want to thank Brett and you all, Noah, for hosting us, having us on. Again, just encourage people to sign up for ForGround if they like this sort of thing. We'll continue to do this with BAM going forward, and again, a lot of other opportunities around this space I know growers are interested in. So really, just want to encourage folks go there, and then you won't lose touch.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for having me. It was a blast. I enjoy doing these. If you have questions for me or want more information, you can go to our website at bamwx.com. But really love doing this, and I hope that people were able to get a good takeaway from it.
Absolutely, a jam-packed session, a lot of information there. And I know Tyler, you'll be at the Farm Progress Show coming up this week. We'll hit the road here soon for that in Boone, Iowa.
Oh yeah, someone can come wake me up on the booth.
All right, guys. On behalf of Tyler Williams, Brett Waltz, ForGround by Bayer, BAM Weather, and No-Till Farmer, thank you all so much for joining us for today's webinar this morning. And again, please feel free to reach out to let us know what you thought of the live event and if there are any topics you'd like to see us cover in future webinars. And No-Till Farmer has other webinar replays available to view, so be sure to take a look at the other topics we have covered. And again, this will be posted on no-tillfarmer.com as well, and the No-Till Farmer YouTube channel also. So thanks again, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your day, and good luck this harvest season.